Good evening, everybody, and welcome to another of our 2022 winter webinars. It is truly winter now, I think, or maybe not truly winter. We haven't got snow, but we've got an inordinate amount of rain and cold, so we'll call them winter webinars now. This is obviously our November one, so welcome. I'm really looking forward to this because I know I'm really out of my depth when it comes to natural capital. And I know we had a webinar back at the very start of the year, which gave me some information about natural capital, but I'm really looking forward to learning a little bit more this evening because it's becoming an increasingly kind of hot topic, I think. And where we sit as tenants with this is probably something that's going to be quite important over the next few years. Just a little bit of admin, if I can, to start with. Obviously, this is being recorded, so that means that you will be able to, if you can't watch it all, or you want to watch it again, or what parts of it again, you can go onto our website or onto our YouTube channel, where you'll be able to see this webinar and indeed all of the previous ones. And it's good to see that quite a few people are doing that. So it's good that people are watching it live, but also picking up on it in the afterwards as well. So that's good. Also, as always, a big thank you to Barclays, who are sponsoring this set of webinars. Really grateful for their support and input into the TFA, and they're helping us to put things like this on for you and others and our members. So very big thank you to Barclays. So just moving on to this evening, the title is to put farm tenants in pole position. I always like that idea, but this is to take advantage of natural capital opportunities. And I'm really pleased to once again be able to welcome, first of all, Charles Cower, who's the director at Natural Capital Consortium Limited and a visiting professor at Harper Adams University. Earlier in the year, or throughout the year probably, most of it, he has sat on the tenancy working group, Baroness Rock's group, which was alongside our chief executive, George Dunn, and was obviously, with all the others on the committee, an extremely good contributor to that group. And we only hope that some of that is taken on board. Charles specialises in rural estate economics and strategy, natural capital, compulsory purchase, valuation and taxation, and he's now very active in the translation of new knowledge into rural professional practice, working alongside countrywide firms across the country on referral consultations, in-house training and development. So as you can see from that short resume, Charles is very well placed to talk to us this evening about natural capital. So welcome, Charles. And also welcome once again, Philip, who is the Managing Director of David Mead Property Consultants, is also a rural chartered surveyor and a TFA recommended professional. He became a fellow of the RICS in 2016 and has appeared as an advocate in over 200 rural arbitrations, agricultural land tribunals and public inquiries, and was appointed to the panel of rural arbitrators by the president of the RICS back in 2009 and the CAUV panel in 2020. So Philip has a really strong depth of knowledge right across the sort of technical advocacy and legal side of everything that goes on in the rural community. So again, welcome back to Philip. You will both remember both Charles and Philip joined us back earlier in the year. So a big welcome to them, and we really look forward to hearing what they've got to say about natural capital. As I say, it's a topic I'm not wholly familiar with, so I'm really looking forward to learning quite a lot this evening, or at least having lots of questions at the end of it. I should also say, if you do have questions during their presentations, if you could put that into the Q&A box, which is at the bottom of your screen, I think. No, it might be at the top of your screen. Mine's at the top of my screen, so that obviously varies on what kind of device you're looking at. So yeah, please put it in the Q&A. We've got a few questions that have been sent in prior to the evening, and we'll be picking some of those up also with Charles and Philip after we've heard from them both. So, excuse me. Without further ado, we'll welcome Charles, who's going to make a start first. So, good evening, Charles, and thank you very much once again for joining us.
Thank you very much indeed, and a great pleasure to be here again and to meet you. What are we going to do today? We're going to talk about natural capital opportunities and the problem. We're going to talk about the ROC report, and after I've done that, I'm going to hand over to Philip, who's going to talk about practical hints and tips. So I do the theory, and Philip does the practice stuff. New government schemes. Well, where are we? We know that there's a sustainable farming initiative in England. We know that there's a sustainable farming scheme in Wales. And we know, or think we know, that there are various schemes which will build on top of those. Although even in the news last week, we gather that local nature recovery, which we were learning about in England, or hoping to learn about, may be replaced by Countryside Stewardship Plus. That sounds like it might be good news, but the time will tell us whether or not that is so. Looking across the whole range of opportunities that natural capital might bring to the rural economy and the agricultural industry, where do we start? This blue square on your screens is my blank canvas this evening. And I'm going to start with what we had thought were going to be the three schemes in England. The Sustainable Farming Initiative, that's clearly getting underway. Local nature recovery could be about to become Countryside Stewardship Plus, and landscape recovery at a real high level one. Some of you, many of you, I imagine, may well also be on the receiving end of various initiatives around carbon and farming for carbon, or reducing emissions from farming. These may be driven by supply chains that you're part of. It may be that the dairy company you supply to is looking at issues like this, or some other supply chain initiatives. But that's not all that's out there. There's biodiversity net gain. As of November next year, all new planning applications will need to show that the environment is 10% richer after the development than it was before. And there's a special dephrometric to help to measure this. As I say, just about all planning applications will be subject to that. That may cause major demands on farmland to provide this biodiversity net gain. Nutrient neutrality. Some of you are undoubtedly in areas where the requirements for nutrient neutrality of new developments are causing particular problems for developers in your area. This is the notion that if you want to build some new houses or other development, for example, you will have to work out the extra load put on your local sewage works of nitrates and phosphates. And that will have to be offset by some savings in nitrogen and phosphorus elsewhere in the same catchment. This is very particular to some areas of the country. Has been a great worry to developers and has brought forth a number of schemes to reduce nutrient inputs onto land in one way or another in order to balance this out. And then there's the long-standing opportunity for diversification. But what we're talking about today is particularly diversification via these so-called ecosystem services. If I had to say what natural capital and ecosystem services are about, in a short phrase, I'd say it's what nature does for us. What nature does for us is feed us. That's called a provisioning service. It provides us with timber. That's called a provisioning service as well. It also keeps things in order. The water cycle, the carbon cycle, that's a regulating service. And then there are things that also help farming to perform and all food production to perform. The pollination of the beneficial insects, that's a supporting service. And there's a pleasure that we all get from nature, whether it's from a simple walk in the countryside or from something more elaborate and inspirational. They're called cultural services. In short, a lot of those services are the basis for leisure and recreation. There will be others as well. And I've set these out on this canvas in this way because I want to draw out a really, really important point as far as agricultural tenancies are concerned. And that's this. If we look at most, I'd say all agricultural tenancies, they were drawn up for farming. They weren't drawn up with all these other things in mind. So when we look at how they map over my broader canvas, we can see that the Sustainable Farming Initiative comes well within the ambit of our traditional scope for an agricultural tenancy agreement. A lot of activities around carbon would be well within that scope as well. When I prepared this slide, I deliberately put local nature recovery on the boundaries. I think it's probably good news if we're going towards Countryside Stewardship Plus, that brings it more firmly within the boundary. And our challenge, I think, in agricultural tenancies is actually how to push out the boundaries of our tenancy agreements so that we can get involved in some of these other opportunities where they're relevant to our farm. I do emphasize that point now about where they are relevant to our farm. It may be that they're not all relevant. Philip will talk about practical pointers earlier on. But at the heart of any consideration about all these daunting or exciting new opportunities has to be a consideration of the business at the heart of all this and its prosperity and sustainability and general success. Philip will expand on that later on. Tenancies, I've said they were drawn up for particular purposes. And of course, we have the two great regimes in England and Wales of the Traditional Agricultural Holdings Act 1986, the full agricultural tenancies, as we sometimes call them, the Agricultural Tenancies Act 1995, and the so-called farm business tenancies. And as a first pointer, in thinking about how you and your farm, your tenanted land, can engage with these matters, it's really important to get a really clear grasp of what sort of tenancy you've got. You probably know that. I'd be surprised if you don't know that. But in particular, what does it say? It's probably buried in the bottom of a file or a safe deposit box or something like that somewhere. But really, this is a time to get it out, blow the dust off it, and see what it says you can, and more particularly what you can't do, and in between, what you can do, but only if your landlord agrees to it. I'm going to be making the point that as tenants, we need to be putting ourselves on the front foot, but we can't do that until we understand where we are. So understanding the sort of tenancy you've got and what it says and what it doesn't say are really key pointers for you to take away from this evening. There are some funny terms in tenancy agreements. So during the course of working on the ROC review, we came across clauses which said, oh yeah, you've got to trim the hedges, but don't let the fields get any smaller. So, you know, if you're being told by conservation advisors, yeah, we want nice, big A-profile hedges, Look out for tenancy terms like that. We came across other tenancy agreements which said that the tenant will claim the surrender payment for BPS and give all the money to the landlord. What's that madness about? And you may well have your own examples, which I'm sure you're welcome to share in the chat box as we go through the wording. So you may find, particularly in recent tenancies, that there is some particularly odd wording, but even if it is odd and peculiar, actually the wording of the tenancy agreement is critically important. What I want to talk about now is the ROC review, because as Mark said when he kindly introduced me, I, with George, was a member of the working group that worked on it. If you don't know what Baroness Kate Rock looks like, that's her on the left, and if you don't know what the cover of the report looks like, that's it on the right. It's a great long document, and I'm not going to tell you all about it, but I'm going to try and highlight the main points about it. A really fundamentally important point from the Rock review, very cogently made by Baroness Rock, was that all of the land management schemes should be accessible and they should be open to tenant farmers. In particular, we recommend that where the terms of any new support schemes are thoroughly aligned with the terms of your tenancy, there should be no need to seek your landlord's consent for that. We also recommended that where the length of a scheme, let's say 5 years, exceeds the immediate length of your tenancy, let's say 3 years, if you are able confidently to form the judgment that actually your tenancy will continue to renew for at least the length of the scheme that you're considering, you should be able to enter the scheme based on your own view of that. We also made the recommendation that where any land use change under some of the schemes, particularly some of the higher level ones, is likely to lead to a permanent change, however you define that, landlords should be required to be joint participants in schemes with their tenants. For productivity schemes, a weakness that we identified was that it was only the farmer who could apply. So if productivity on your tenanted farm needs investment in longer term capital by the landlord, it should be possible to make a joint application. You'd think there was something novel about this. In my opinion, there's nothing novel about it at all. I started my career in the early 1980s with the Agricultural Development and Advisory Service when it was part of the Ministry of Agriculture, Fisheries and Food. At that time, we ran agricultural and horticultural development scheme programs. It was routine in those for landlords and tenants to apply jointly, for landlords to receive grant funding on new buildings, and for tenants to receive grant funding on kitting out those buildings and other elements of kit that were needed. We also recommended that woodland schemes should be possible to be the subject of joint applications, so that actually landlords start to discuss woodland planting with tenants so that both can benefit from it. We pointed out that DEFRA should find ways to promote investment in upgrading infrastructure. I'm sure I don't need to tell you that there is a lot of legacy work from the days of those MAF grants, which is now distinctly showing its age. There is a need in many ways to help the farming industry by allowing it to move on to more modern infrastructure, buildings, kit, and all the rest of it. And for all the other schemes, gosh, there's some acronyms here, aren't there? But the England Woodland Creation offer, natural capital markets, the land use framework, which we don't have yet, but we are promised next year, a whole framework for how rural land should be used in England. We recommended that, this really must be tenant proofed, so that the framework itself addresses the role, the participation, the needs of tenant farmers. We also made some points about new entrant policy. I'm not going to dwell on those this evening, because we're mainly concerned with you as active existing tenants. Private natural capital markets, what are they about? That's the possibility of selling your carbon, of selling biodiversity credits for biodiversity net gain. Where do tenants fit in that? My original canvas sort of drew out some of that sort of stuff. But what we called for was guidelines from government to ensure that tenants have a role in that. And that went more broadly than that, because one of the things that we discovered is that DEFRA itself, despite the sterling efforts of people like George over the years, doesn't really get tenant farming. Actually, since the report was published, I met somebody from DEFRA on Monday, part of my exchange with that person was a quick rundown on how agricultural tenancies work. I did make the point that rather underlined one of the recommendations in the ROC review. So DEFRA itself needs to make sure that A, it understands the tenanted sector, and B, that all its initiatives are proofed against, or for, I should say, the interests of tenants. Part of the problem there is that DEFRA can't tell you about the participation of tenants in different schemes. As far as DEFRA is concerned, you're all farmers, which is fair enough. You are all farmers, but some of you are tenant farmers, some of you are owner-occupier farmers, and a lot of you are mixed tenure farmers. DEFRA doesn't routinely gather that data on screen participation. To that end, we thought there needed to be a really senior responsibility for tenancies within DEFRA. It should be in the responsibilities of one of the ministers. Below that level, there should be a senior DEFRA director who has responsibility for the broader question of land ownership and occupation, because in some senses, the tenancy question was just part of a wider problem of DEFRA, therefore government, not really understanding how land ownership and occupation, and that of course includes tenancies, works in England. We called for an urgent review of tenancy legislation, both as a consultation with the sector and more broadly, but also asking the Law Commission to look again at the legislation in these areas. For example, you can look across several acts of Parliament and find several different definitions of agriculture. Some of the main ones date back to 1947 with all sorts of consequences. We also felt that there was a great scope to extend the use of alternative dispute resolution, that's what ADR is, and the use of arbitration. Some forms of ADR actually are much more user-friendly than arbitration itself, and there's a lot to be said for the role of mediation where the parties are up for it. That, in turn, led to concerns, and as a land agent myself, I'm sorry to have to include this in the presentation, that we did hear of some pretty poor behaviour on the part of land agents. And although I would rather we didn't have to make this recommendation, and I'm sure it doesn't endear to me, to my professional peers, there clearly was evidence for the need for improved scrutiny and regulation of land agents. There's some more we might say about that and how you might respond to that when we come to the discussion section. Scotland has a tenant farming commissioner who's done some very useful work, and we suggested that England might need one as well. Taxation is a big problem. It's a big problem because it's a major worry of landlords. A major worry that they have, one of several, is that they may lose agricultural property relief on their let farmland if it goes too far away from agriculture. So if you go too far down the natural capital markets line, are you still farming? Are you still agricultural? Will that jeopardize agricultural property relief? And that's a serious financial worry to an agricultural landlord. If the land's let on an FBT, for example, and it's worth, let's say, £10,000 an acre, that's the difference between no tax and £4,000 an acre tax. That and a number of other aspects of taxation really need urgent attention. We all know that reports have been made and they then gather dust on the shelves. We were mindful of that danger, and therefore we recommended that DEFRA should make a progress report every year on how it's getting on with the agricultural transition plan. There is also an obligation to report on progress with the food strategy. And those reports should include a specific section on tenancies. The purpose of that is to keep DEFRA's eye on the ball, so that this doesn't just get parked as very nice report, good work, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much, but now we've got more important things to be getting on with. There are some case studies in the report. I do recommend you have a look at them. Some are good. I'd really like to highlight the good ones, because what I'm going to do now is highlight the bad ones, but there were some good ones and they're worth knowing about. As for some of the bad ones, what were tenants concerned about in the survey that was commissioned? Poor communication. 44% of the tenant respondents didn't feel comfortable discussing developments with their landlords. Delay was a regular problem. Rent reviews, which then didn't really happen or happened very close to the term date. Notices to quit, which were routinely served, but then withdrawn at the 11th hour. Comments from participants in the workshops. Tenants need protection against the worst excesses of landlords and their agents. Agents are a wedge in the relationship, not helpful. Agents using unsavory tactics, using the balance of power to pressure tenants into accepting unfair terms. More on this same theme. A tenant who had been in place for 14 years, had some bright ideas, took the new proposals to the landlord. The landlord's response: oh, well, we're already planning to create a nature reserve, extensify the grazing using grazing licenses, and bring your tenancy to an end. What a blow. Another tenant responded saying, we're in annual rolling FBTs, we get a notice to quit every year, and then it's withdrawn, and we carry on from year to year in this way. A quotation from a letter from a land agent to a tenant: there will be no negotiations, cause any fuss, and we'll offer the tenancy elsewhere. Another example, not exactly of the same thing, and certainly not in the in the ROC report, is the case of Crown Estate and Wackley. Poor Mr. Wackley, very successful dairy farmer in Scotland, took up a tenancy in southeastern England, was given various reassurances by the landlord's agents about the condition and suitability of the farm. All proved to be unfounded, and a story that ended very badly indeed, as far as liabilities are concerned. I think there is an important moral of that tale, though, which is the expectations of behaviour that it puts on landlord agents. And I think it's worth pointing out that landlords agents do have codes of practice to which they're expected to work, and some of the examples that we saw do not comply with those codes of practice. That sets some background from me, where agricultural tenancies sit in relation to to the natural capital opportunities more generally, how we need practically to think about ways to extend that, how we need to be familiar to a greater extent than ever with the contents of our tenancy agreements, and if you've not had a chance to study it, some of the key points from the ROC report. I've been very selective. There's a lot more in there as well if you choose to look. That's it from me. Now it's over to Philip for action and the practical stuff. Philip, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Charles. Hopefully it'll be a fairly smooth handover and that you'll now be seeing my slides, which start where Charles's slides finished off. So thank you, Charles, for that introduction. I'm going to sort of try and deal with the practical side of where do you go from here if you've identified a natural capital opportunity you'd like to think about and like to take some action on. What do you do next? And I would try and the first thing I would say, and I sit on one of the working groups again with George, the Welsh Government working group, looking at the sustainable farming scheme in Wales and looking at how we can make that, tailor that to make sure it works for tenants. And one of the key things taken away from one of the meetings we've had there and also from the ROC report is collaboration. And I'm going to top and tail my presentation with that message. I think you'll see as we go through that it's the best way forward if you can. And I realize that not all tenants are in a situation to be able to, or indeed have a landlord that wants to collaborate with them, but collaboration is often the best way forward. And I'll try and cover that a little bit more. But from a practical point of view, what do you do if you've identified an opportunity or would like to step into the natural capital world? Well, the first port of call is always your tenancy agreement. Charles has already touched on this, but what does it say? Well, a lot of the answers are actually in the tenancy agreement itself, and I'm hoping with some of my slides that I can give some guidance as to what to look for, because I appreciate for somebody, as somebody who makes a living out of reading tenancy agreements, it's very easy for me to pontificate and say, oh, just look at your tenancy agreement. Most people probably haven't looked at their tenancy agreement in years, and as Charles say, they dust it down, look at it and think, oh, a lot of legal gobbledygook, where do I start? But actually, when you get into it, some of it is quite easily understood, and there is a whole host of people there willing to help you, ranging from staff at TFA headquarters to agents, recommended agents like myself. We're only a phone call away. Part of my undertaking with being a TFA valuer is that if a TFA member wants to pick up the phone to me or an email and wants a quick query on a tenancy agreement, including natural capital, then I'm more than willing to help. I'm willing to have a look at someone's tenancy agreement, as I know most of the support staff and people working with George would be as well. So don't feel overawed by looking at a tenancy agreement, but hopefully some of the pointers I can show you this evening will give you an idea as to where to start. So one of the first things, are there any unusual provisions? Well, if you go back in time, tenancy agreements probably pre-1980s. I mean, the way the Agricultural Holdings Acts have sort of emerged over the years up until 1986. The Tenancy Acts before 86 was 1948, really the major one. So any tenancy agreements probably sort of before the early 1980s generally don't hold many surprises. That's roughly when I started my career, around about 84, 85, when milk quotas came in. Then suckler quotas, sheep quotas, IACs, SFS, SPS, BPS, all this sort of range of different cap reform, all that sort of thing. And that's when you start to see these sort of provisions starting to emerge in new tenancy agreements. And of course, with the implementation of farm business tenancies in 1995, there's a whole new raft of provisions that you might class as unusual emerging from these agreements, trying to capture these payments, trying to help landlords avoid various taxes, inheritance tax, APR, all those sort of things.
I didn't get that. Could you try again?
Sorry, my watch. So you want to go pre 1980, there's not much to worry about, but post 1980, this is when you start to see these unusual agreements. Any requirements in the original agreement, have they wandered over time? Sorry, there was one point. Yeah, one of the sort of unusual provisions, just to backtrack a little bit, that I've seen in a recent couple of years, and actually was in touch with George about, and I'll just quote the clause or briefly say what it said. the tenant was obliged to use best endeavours to go into whatever grant scheme and subsidy scheme exists or may come into being during the tenancy. Now, that on the face of it, you might say, well, why wouldn't a tenant use his best endeavours to go into any grant scheme or subsidy scheme that may come into existence during the tenancy? But thinking about one of the points Charles touched on is that the grant schemes and subsidy schemes aren't the only ones out there, and certainly aren't going to be the only ones out there. So if you have a tenancy agreement that obliges you to go into the best subsidy or grant scheme available, you might find that you're actually shooting yourself in the foot when it comes to looking into private natural capital arrangements. So those are the sort of unusual provisions that you perhaps need to be not wary of, because if it's in your agreement, you're stuck with it. But those are the sort of things you need to be looking for, particularly if you're considering one of these sort of private natural capital arrangements that might come onto the market or are already emerging onto the market in the next few years. The point about have you got any requirements in the original agreement, have they wandered over time? And what we mean by that, a classic example of that is I have many clients who have boundaries and ditches that join landlords, either land that they farm themselves or woodlands that the landlord owns but aren't in the tenancy. Over the years, the landlord, for various reasons, lack of funds, whatever the excuses are, hasn't managed these woodland boundaries. Branches fall off the trees, trees fall over, damage the fences, ditches become clogged up. Tenant gets fed up invariably because his land's getting flooded or the fences are damaged and the stock are getting out. And although it's the landlord's, very often invariably the landlord's responsibility to repair these fences and dig out these ditches and mend these boundaries, the tenant, having got fed up with the circumstances, just says, oh, well, I'll go and do it myself. And over a number of years, 5, 10, 15, 20 years, has just got used to managing these boundaries, managing these ditches. Now, if these ditches and boundaries become part of a natural capital program or natural capital opportunity, you've got to be absolutely certain that those are within your control. So it's those sort of things you need to be aware of. It may not be immediately evident from the written tenancy agreement, but you need to be aware of the sort of the past history of the farm to make sure that if you are getting into a natural capital arrangement, that you have the ability to enter into these arrangements, and you're not actually treading on the landlord's toes when it comes to liabilities and responsibilities. How long have you got? That's the big question. What is the term of the tenancy agreement? Now, for 1986 Agricultural Holdings Act tenants, that's a fairly straightforward answer. You, on paper, would have a lifetime tenancy. You may have a succession or two to come after that as well. But in law, your tenancy agreement is an annual tenancy agreement. And that's something which, when people see that written down, the tenancy shall continue from year to year, causes concern, because they think, well, a number of times people have phoned me up, so I thought you negotiated a lifetime tenancy for me, but the one I've just signed says it's a year-to-year tenancy. Well, in law, it is a year-to-year tenancy, but the lifetime bit is because you have the ability to stop the landlord, in most circumstances, from serving a notice to quit, but not all circumstances. The landlord could, for example, in most cases, take back land for non-agricultural use. If there's a breach of covenant, the landlord may be able to serve you a notice to quit. But other than that, lifetime tenancies, 86 Act tenancies, tend to be, as it says on the tin, for life. When it comes to farm business tenancies, that's a different matter altogether, because there are a number of things you need to be aware of here. I had a case, or a number of cases, with a big institutional landlord up in the Derbyshire Dales a few years ago, where the tenancy agreements all said 15 years on the front. And the group of tenants who I was acting for were convinced that their tenancy agreements were for 15 years. And in fact, some of them were looking to go into HLS schemes, etc., etc. But actually, when we got into the nitty gritty and looked into the small print clause, so-and-so at page 37 of the tenancy agreement, there were break clauses. And the break clauses allowed the landlord to take the tenancy back every 5 years. So it might have said 15 years on the front, but the reality was they were 5-year tenancies. And that's very important, again, when you're looking to get into or considering getting into long-term or longer-term arrangements that may exceed the term of the tenancy agreement. So you have to be careful as to how long your tenancy will subsist. Again, something that cropped up in the recent Welsh Government Working Party is a lot of farm business tenancies, either on purpose or just through agents not renewing them, have become, may have started as a 10-year or a 5-year or a fixed term tenancy agreement, but just become annual rolling farm business tenancies. So again, you might have a tenancy agreement that started in 2004 for 15 years, but that will have ended in 2019, well, not ended, but it will have converted into an annual rolling tenancy in 2019. And you actually are therefore susceptible at any time to a 12-month notice, unless you renegotiate a longer term. So again, it's not necessarily what it says on the front of the agreement. And again, part resumption clauses for the landlord to be able to take back parts of the farm. If you enter into a long-term natural capital agreement and then find the landlord takes back a couple of acres for housing, you might be in breach of that long-term natural capital agreement. So you need to be wary of these sort of clauses and how long a tenancy agreement might or might not last. The next thing to look for is what we call the user clauses. Now, the user clauses are normally fairly much towards the front of an agreement, again fairly standard in the older agreements, but they can range from what I call specific or focused user clauses, where clauses say that the farm can be only used as a dairy farm or a mixed farm. You get more general ones, and these are the most common, where it says that the farm shall only be used for agricultural purposes. Sometimes you then get limitations added onto user clauses, so you're not allowed to use the farm for caravan sites, as a caravan site, camping, festivals. That's quite common. You get more specific limitations or don'ts. You can't enter into grant schemes or management agreements without landlord's written consent. And in some cases, although these are quite rare, there may be no user clauses at all. There are still a large-ish number of oral tenancy agreements out there. And one of the sort of underlying principles of this sort of thing is that if it doesn't say you can't do it, then you can. If you have no written tenancy agreement, or if you have a very basic one, 2 lines on a piece of paper, I hereby rent you the farm for the next 20 years, whatever it is, then if there is no user clause, then that does give you quite substantial options, subject to what we discussed before in terms of how long the tenancy, etc. What are the remedies if you're caught by a user clause and want to go to the landlord to talk about these opportunities? Well, one of the main ones is rent, because of course the rent, particularly on the lifetime tenancies, is based on the productive and related earning capacity of the farm, the ability of the farm to make money. Now, if the landlord is going to insist on watertight or very strict user clauses that say you can't do this and you can't do that, then it's usually very well worth reminding the landlord or his agent that that is a double-edged sword. Because if you're restricting the ability of the farm to make money in these new fields, these new areas of natural capital, then you're restricting the ability of the landlord to charge you a rent competitive with farms that don't have those restrictions. There are more sort of statutory possibilities, such as the Agriculture Act, which has been introduced, which gives the tenant the ability to apply for consent for finance, for something which affects the finances of the farm. I won't go into any great detail about that, but there are statutory remedies as well, possibly going to arbitration, asking for relaxation of the terms of the tenancy agreement. I say we could have a whole evening session on that, but just so that you know, there are opportunities out there. But one of the stronger arguments I usually use is the rent point. The next set of clauses to look for, what I call alienation clauses. That's a slightly unusual word. Alienation means the ability for a farmer to not stay in occupation, or to get rid of his, to change the occupation of part of his farm. And these are typically along the lines of, you'll see on the screen there, the text in the screen here. The very common one is not to assign, underlet, or part with possession of the holding or any part thereof without previous consent in writing of the landlord. Now, if it just says in your tenancy agreement, it actually gives you fairly good latitude to do not what you like, because you can't assign, and assigning is when you sign a piece of paper and literally pass the tenancy on to somebody else. Underlet or subletting is where you remain the tenant, but you let somebody else come in and occupy the farm and they pay you a rent. You sort of become a tenant in between, or what they call a mezzanine tenant. Parting with possession, well, that's pretty unusual. That means you can't sell the farm. Well, obviously you can't, because it's not yours, but you can't give up possession of the farm. So if you just have that first couple of lines in your tenancy agreement, that's not too bad. But a lot of these agreements, certainly the modern ones, go a lot further than that. Not without previous consent in writing the landlord to grant a person a license to graze stock on the holding, or take in or feed on the holding stock belonging to any other person. That can be quite restrictive, especially if, for example, you're in a partnership and it may be that the partnership owns the stock. So you've got to be careful with that. if you're going to start going into these sort of arrangements for natural capital, they generally probably won't involve grazing of livestock, but you've got to watch out for that sort of clause. And then not without previous consent to sell, let, or otherwise dispose of grazing or mowing or growing crops on the holding, another common one. And then one of the more restrictive ones is where and certainly these are in the more modern agreements now, where you're not allowed to enter into any contractual arrangement or share farming agreement or cropping arrangements with a third party. Now that is the sort of alienation clause that may well bite on a natural capital proposal. That is the sort of thing you need to look out for, because you could be in breach of your tenancy agreement if you do sign up to some sort of natural capital arrangement that involves a third party coming in and doing some different cropping on your farm without landlord's consent. So do be aware of that. The next thing to look for is what they call landlord's reservations. It won't necessarily say landlord's reservations. It'll say something like accepted and reserved to the landlord, or the landlord hereby reserves, etc. And typically, again, going back to your old agreements, they would have been sporting rights, timber, minerals, treasure, wayleaves and easements. More recently, you start seeing water and water features dropping into these clauses. Natural capital, you actually see clauses saying that the landlord shall retain all natural capital opportunities on the farm. That is a big red flag, I think, in many ways, because if you're restricting the ability to the tenant to go into natural capital opportunities, then you're actually almost changing the nature of the tenancy agreement itself. You're almost taking away the tenant's right to exclusive occupation. And there's a question there as to whether or not it is still a tenancy. And the right to enter schemes. We've seen a clause along those lines earlier on. Again, something that does crop up in modern tenancy agreements. How is the business doing? You need to think about this. I'm just conscious of time, but you need to think about how the business is doing before you go into these schemes. You need to weigh up the agricultural profit and turnover, in other words, the money being made from traditional farming on the farm, compared to the profit and turnover from the planned enterprise. And the reason for that is because you then need to say, well, does that mean to say that the farm is still generally agricultural? That may have an effect on planning in the local planning permission, that sort of thing, but also the user clauses and the nature of the tenancy, which we just touched on, and also implications for the landlord's tax position. Now, when I was discussing the slides with Charles earlier this week, I put this slide up and Charles said, well, but why is that the tenant's problem? And he's quite right. Why is that the tenant's problem? But the answer to that is it's the tenant's problem because it's the landlord's problem. Very much a lot of what I do in my job is trying to understand or trying to anticipate how a landlord, when I'm acting for a tenant, will respond to a proposal. You need to try and put yourself in the shoes of that landlord to a certain extent and understand where he's coming from. And if the landlord, you're going to go and see the landlord with this shiny new proposition for natural capital, and it's going to affect his agricultural property relief on a large part of his estate, then you need to anticipate that, because that might be the reason why he says no. So whilst the tax position is not your problem as tenant, it is an issue that you need to bear in mind when making proposals. Improvements, just touching on these quickly, I think just whiz through this, but one of the main things you need to consider is if you've just spent a lot of money on a brand new parlour or some sort of significant building on the farm, and you then go into some sort of diverse business, and that building becomes not redundant, becomes less valuable or less important to the business, then the value of that as an improvement, bearing in mind that improvements are compensated on the value they add to the holding, if they no longer have a value to the holding because the business is diversified, you might find that has an effect on your own investment in the farm. So do bear that in mind. Implications for rent. Very quickly, there was you have to look at the latent value, the value of the farm as it stands compared to other farms, and has it got something special? Because if it's got something special, then that's latent value the landlord might be able to charge you extra rent for. But if it's got something that all the other farms in the area have got, and you realize that value by doing something yourself, by investing in something different, then the landlord, under the case Tummins versus Barclays Bank, very old, well, 40-year-old case, cannot necessarily charge you extra rent for you realizing that latent value. And that's an important consideration when looking at natural capital ventures. And consent required. Do you need consent to carry out improvements? Well, the tenancy agreement will give some guidance on that. If the improvement is required for complying with regulations like pollution, under the 86 Act tenancies, you have rights to demand or go to the tribunal for consent, and actually you can apply to the tribunal for consent under section 67, getting into a bit technical detail there, but there are provisions in the Agricultural Holdings Act, not under farm business tenancies particularly, but under the old lifetime tenancies, to allow a tenant to apply to a third party for consent if the landlord unreasonably withholds it. The other quick thing to consider is succession. This is the last of my slides, so we're now getting towards the end of this. But do consider the implications for succession. Obviously, this only applies to 86 Act tenancies. The key criteria for succession includes the applicant having to have obtained the majority of their income from their agricultural work on the holding for 5 out of the last 7 years. If you diversify into natural capital, and that generates significantly more income than the farming enterprises on the farm, and that income is not agricultural, then the applicant in the future may not be deriving their income from their agricultural work on the holding. So do bear that in mind. So they say that could be an issue if natural capital revenue becomes a significant proportion of the farm's income if it's non-agricultural. And it could, I suppose, I thought about this last night, could affect suitability. If you spend the next 5 years managing something that's completely non-agricultural, then maybe a landlord might argue that you no longer have the experience in up-to-date agricultural processes and practices that you would have done if you'd stayed exclusively in agriculture. So my overriding message as I started, and I'll finish, you can see there are a lot of difficulties, but there are a lot of opportunities out there. And the overriding message, if you have a compliant landlord, a good landlord-tenant relationship, then collaboration is the first port of call. Some of the best operators, the clients I deal with, have these good working relationships with landlords, but I fully appreciate that landlords come in all shapes and sizes, and through no choice of their own sometimes. You might be dealing with a corporation, you might be dealing with an institution with all sorts of policies, you might be dealing with a local authority who don't have any inspiration for natural capital at all. Those things will change the way you approach a natural capital opportunity. But the sort of overriding message is collaboration if possible. And that sums up my presentation. Back to you, Mark.
Brilliant. Thank you, Philip, and thank you, Charles. And here was I thinking we were just trying to grow some food and feed a few people, but clearly there's a lot more to it than we thought. But thank you very much for those, and I think there's a lot of stuff to consider in both those presentations. I'm conscious a little bit of time, so and I'm always conscious that an hour is about long enough for a Zoom thing, but I might just, if it's okay with those attending, obviously if you've got things to go to, please disappear, but I might just ask Charles and Philip if they might stay for an additional 5 or 10 minutes just to answer a few of the questions that we've had put, if that's okay.
No problem, Mark. I've been monitoring the questions, and there's one that I've answered directly. It was about when does a notice to quit run from, and the answer is briefly that it runs from the anniversary of the tenancy, not from the date that you receive it. So that's in the answered question. But we've got some interesting questions, and I think we can probably aggregate a couple of them. So, for instance, Michael has asked if there is a universally agreed scope of what natural capital actually comprises. The short answer, Michael, is no, there isn't. I referred to natural capital as being what nature does for us earlier on, and that's about as good as you're going to get. There's lots of extensive definitions which can build on that, but they don't boil down to much more than what nature does for us as well.
Charles, could you cover the question above that Alan Hutton has asked, which maybe Philip could also contribute on, because certainly towards the end of Philip's presentation there, the sort of issue of what is agriculture and what is not agricultural clearly has quite a big impact on the nature of people's tenancies. So it would be interesting to you could both have a pop at answering that, please.
Yeah. Well, it all depends. I'm sorry, Alan, is the answer. And that was one of the things that underlined the Rock Review's point about having a review of just what agriculture means. my own opinion, it's nobody's opinion but mine, but you're welcome to share it or challenge it, is that we actually missed a major opportunity in that Health and Harmony command paper and then the Agriculture Act that came after it to define what we think agriculture means in the 21st century, because there are definitions of agriculture all over the place. And it's not so much that there's a black and white distinction, more that there's a huge grey area in between, where some examples that might lead to biodiversity net gain. So, for instance, some forms of biodiversity net gain would be more traditional pastures, and they may well be grazed with perhaps more traditional breeds of cattle. That's still agriculture, no problem. But take it out into something which is more at the sort of scrub end of things, the tree planting end of things, and you've almost certainly left the definition of agriculture behind. Nutrient neutrality may well be achieved by extensive grassland management. That's agriculture. But if it's achieved by taking land out of farming and putting it into wetlands, which aren't grazed, it probably stops being agriculture. And this is part of the challenge and the complication really in these things really. But I do think an understanding of some of those sorts of issues might actually help with some of the questions that John Wibley has posed about relationships between landlord and tenant and the role of brokerage. And I think there's tons of scope for that, of tenants taking the initiative. I mean, there was a sense in the Rock Report work that a lot of tenants are very nervous of approaching their landlords about these things, and I think we do need to challenge that where we can really, and try, and maybe this is a task for the TFA to sort of try and raise the game that actually tenants should be seen on equal terms with their landlords, not as some kind of junior partner, but as responsible, respected business people and countryside managers who have a great deal to offer, and in most cases things that actually landlords would find hard to achieve on their own. But that's enough from me. Let's let Philip in with his own observations on these things too.
Yeah, I think you pretty much covered Alan Hutton's point, Charles. I agree with you. It's what definition of agriculture do we use? I mean, you look at the Planning Acts, you look at the Agricultural Holdings Act, you look at various other acts. The definition, although largely the same, does vary. I mean, if you look at the definition of agriculture under the 86 Act, includes horticulture, fruit growing, seed growing, dairy farming, livestock breeding and keeping, the use of land as grazing land, meadow land, osier land, market gardens. Now, one of the important points there, just as the use of land as grazing land, it doesn't matter what you graze on it. You don't have to graze agricultural stock necessarily. You grow zebras if you want to. I had an arbitration many years ago, involving where a zoo wanted to take some land back. A zoo wanted to take some land back to extend their zoo. And the argument from the tenants at the time, interestingly enough, was, well, the stock that'll be grazing it don't have to be agriculture. It's still agriculture because it's grazing land. And I think that sort of sums up and sort of comes to the same conclusion that Charles does, is that natural capital, biodiversity net gain, nutrient neutrality in themselves are not necessarily non-agricultural, but it depends what you do to get nutrient neutrality. You can plant trees to get nutrient neutrality, and that would be non-agricultural. But you could, in theory, go organic and plant spring crops and not put any nitrogen on your wheat and on your spring wheat, and have a very poor crop of wheat, but that would reduce the nitrogen going into the watercourses, and therefore there would be a reduction in nitrogen. You may get some payment for that. That would still be agriculture because you're still growing crops. So it depends on the scheme you go into, and that really is where I come from when it comes to opportunities for tenants. I see a further down from Mark Exelby. What opportunities are there for tenants? Well, the big sort of landscaping projects where your major changes to the farm itself are probably out of the reach of tenants unless they do collaborate wholly with the landlord. But minimum till, changing cropping regimes, changing grazing regimes, these sort of things might be of interest to local businesses on a private natural capital prospect who want to be seen to be green, and they might pay you to change your cropping regime. Those are the sort of opportunities that you wouldn't necessarily need to go to your landlord about because you are still farming the farm. So that's really my sort of answer to those. John Wibley's question about landlord and tenant relationships, absolutely. I mean, I said from the start and the finish of my presentation, and I get this, day in, day out in my daily work, is it's all about a good landlord tenant relationship. I mean, I make a significantly large part of my living from where landlord and tenant relationships break down, but ironically that's not what I like to see. I'd much rather see a good landlord tenant relationship, a business relationship. That's what it is at the end of the day, a business partnership, because those are the farms that thrive. Those are the farms that work really well, where there's mutual respect that Charles talks about between landlords and tenants, and they work together. They look at the opportunities together. The landlord gets a good rent and invests in the farm. The tenant gets a good income and invests in the farm, and the next generation can take over and everybody's happy. And I think landlord and tenant relationships are absolutely key. I'm conscious also, George or Mark, that we had some other questions as well. I don't want to dwell on.
Yeah, I wonder if I could just pick up on what appears to be a sort of basic question here, which was asked on one of the previous questions, is how do you measure how do you have a baseline for natural capital, and how do you evidence? There's a couple of questions that sort of touch on how you evidence that you've either grown, developed your natural capital, or indeed your natural capital is reduced. How does that all kind of fit together, and what do we as tenants need to be sort of aware of?
Yeah, there's no single answer to that, Mark, again, because natural capital is a very, very broad thing. It's like, I mean, in a sense, it's like asking, how do you measure the output of a farm? Yeah, you might measure it all in money, and certainly there is a natural capital element which puts a value on everything. But actually, if it's a dairy farm, you're looking at litres of milk. If it's an arable farm, you're looking at tons of barley and wheat and all the rest of it. So there's a little bit of apples and pears about that. Some of the elements of natural capital can be valued, though. For instance, if there was one thing that it would be relatively easy for a lot of our audience tonight to do, it would be to get hold of the DEFRA biodiversity metric. It's a spreadsheet you can download from their website, and you can go through that and enter the areas of your fields in the spreadsheet and what's in the fields, and it will give you the biodiversity score for your farm. Now, that's your baseline for biodiversity gain. So if you could improve on that in any areas, that may be biodiversity gain that a developer would pay for. But going back to the collaboration idea, a lot of that won't be yours to sell because it's reserved to the landlord, or because you don't have 30 years on the farm to be able to offer the assurance anyway. But it may well be that it's under your control. That may be the opening gambit for a discussion with the landlord to say, well, we could do these things. We could both make a bit of money. We could both be a lot better off for it. Let's just work out how we go through this stuff. If you have done some of that thinking initially with the biodiversity metric, as DEFRA calls it, that would be your start point. However, if you want to think about soil carbon and stuff like that, extending the soil sampling that a good number of you are probably doing already to include measurements of soil organic matter, not only near the surface but also at depth, is a good way of getting a proxy for your carbon. What on earth use is that going to be to you? It may well help you actually in the management of your soils for agricultural productivity, because of the strong evidence that good soil organic matter leads to more reliable soils and productivity. But also, if your supply chain comes knocking on your door saying, what are you doing about carbon? You've got the start of an answer there. If, and it's a big if, we do get a soil carbon code, having that sort of data is going to be your start point in it. But for a lot of the things, there are no universally agreed or reliable metrics yet. Should that put us off altogether? I'd say no, it shouldn't put us off altogether, because actually, just in terms of simple baseline stuff, start to think about what your farm does for the environment. You've got hedges. You've got grassland, which, depending on how you manage it, might be really, really good. You've also got the potential. Think about those corners, which frankly probably aren't earning their living in farming terms, but could in other ways. You're thinking, well, he's going to tell us to plant trees on those corners, and that's none of our business. Quite right to a point. But actually, what about a discussion with the landlord about some tree planting in the farm? We think that trees are all the landlord's business. We worry about landlords serving notices to quit on parts of farms because they can resume them for tree planting. But actually, it's open to tenants to plant trees as well. It is one of the long-term improvements in the Agricultural Holdings Act that you can ask for your landlord's consent for. But there may be, in the context of rent negotiations, like Philip has mentioned, scope to say, well, look, landlord, that's a useful bit there for tree planting. It might be rather better with your trees in it than with my wheat in it. What about we take that out of the tenancy? Review the terms, discuss the rent appropriately. There may be all sorts of possibilities around that. But the general question is there actually a natural capital baseline test that you can use? No, there isn't. We're not likely to see one for some time. If you want to judge the performance of a crop of wheat, you use quite different criteria physically than you do for judging the performance of a dairy herd. That's the sort of parallel to hang on to, Mark. That different horses for different courses, if I can put it that way.
Okay, thanks, Charles. Philip, have you got anything to add to where we sit as tenants with how we're measuring natural capital and baselines? Because there is quite a lot of talk about, get a baseline, which presumably, obviously, as Charles has said, is going to vary depending on how you're farming it and what you've already done, perhaps, for your environmental schemes.
I think it depends on how the private natural capital market develops as well, because your private natural capital will develop with small local companies possibly wanting to hook up with local farmers. And they may have their own way of not necessarily measuring the natural capital, but their own way of making sure that if they enter into a contract with the local farmer to become more greener or to allow more public access or to build a pond or to do whatever they want to be seen to do, they will perhaps develop their own, not metrics, but their own sort of criteria or set of boxes to tick, which they will review under the contract at the end of the year. And I can see that developing. And I can see that sort of developing in a wider sense and people starting to sort of generally adopt these sort of methods or metrics, if you like, in the private sector. And I think the private, if it tapped into properly, I think the private natural capital market is going to far exceed the government-led ones. And in some ways, I think the government-led ones are almost designed to create a floor for these prices and sort of encourage landowners and tenants and farmers into more into the private sector, because of course the government then doesn't have to fund it. And I think that's where you'll see more sort of ad hoc measurement of natural capital, because it'll be between private arrangements between landlords, between landowners and local business possibly.
Right. Yeah. Interesting. Well, I think there's quite an interesting time ahead then, isn't there, with natural capital? I mean, I can only endorse what you've both said about landlord-tenant collaboration. It seems to me that with the sort of removal of BPS, new schemes coming in, but also just the development of natural capital and more demands from us on the environment side, it's becoming more and more important for landlords and tenants to have a positive collaboration in how they work, because the way in which you generate some income from a piece of land is potentially a lot more complicated than it's ever been. You're not just doing some farming, there's all sorts of other stuff, and everybody should potentially have a slice of that action. So I think we're in for quite a complex but potentially quite an interesting time with lots of opportunities ahead. I'm going to draw things to a close. I'm conscious that we've run over time. I think that simply reflects that this is a very interesting and complex topic on all of what you've both talked about this evening, from natural capital, the ROC review, landlords, tenants, the clauses in our in our tenancy agreements, and there's really a huge amount of food for thought there. So thank you both very much for giving us your wisdom this evening. And I would ask you that we've got a few questions that were posted before. I wonder if you'd be good enough to perhaps answer those, and we'll post the answers on the on our website. That would be really helpful. Thank you. So really, it really just all for me to say is, first of all, thank you all, those who've managed to stick out the full hour and 10 minutes for hanging in there. I'm sure you found it interesting. A big thank you to both Philip and Charles for their presentations. Very interesting as ever. A quick reminder that the next event is on the 7th of December, which is Deaf for a Future Farming Policy Update and what it means for farmers in England. Hoping that we will have some news by that time as to what is going on. We've had some really quite unsettled political weeks and months ahead of this, so we really need to see what is coming down the line now. So that'll be interesting. That's on the 7th of December, so please sign up to see us there. And for those of you visiting the Welsh Winter Fair, it's on Monday the 28th, which is next Monday even. So we're there on Monday and Tuesday, 28th and 29th, with our TFA chairman, Dennis Matheson, and our vice chairman, Elwyn Evans. And as always, George Dunn will be attending both days. So those of you who want to get across to that, I ought to know exactly where that is, but I don't, I'm sorry to say, but I'm sure those of you who are going know where it is. So apologies to our Welsh members for not knowing exactly where that is.
It's in
North Wales. Thanks, Philip. Okay, thank you. So if you can attend that, that would be great. Another thank you, please, to Barclays for sponsoring the event, and thanks to everybody for attending. And I'll just wish you all a good night, and hope you've had a useful evening.